All right, so as I'm sure everybody knows, speaking tonight is Todd Davies, the author of the History of Arcadia visionary fiction series and the Jam Today cookbook memoir series. She is also the editorial director of Indie Exterminating Angel Press, and this is the third of her third-part series. Tonight she's going to talk about visions of the future.
Yeah, which we need more than ever at the moment. So I think everyone here knows what Exterminating Angel Press is and what the online magazine is. So I don't really have to explain. And it's great to meet some more people who are contributing to the magazine tonight. Although I have met Barry in person, I will say. But it's great to meet David Bolton, not my other David,
Yeah.
I've met many times. So I'm going to blather on. You know that my favorite part of these things has been when we all talk about the subject. So, but I have some things I'm going to say before that, just to get us kind of situated in where the conversation should go. I'm also going to bring on, when I'm through, I'm going to ask Marissa to talk a little bit about poetry and how poetry can move things forward, and the poets can join in on that. And then I want to talk to Colby Elliott of Last Word Audio, who has done the audiobooks for EAP. He's done The Supergirls by Mike Madrid, which is hugely successful, I must say. His voice is incredible. And he's done two of the History of Arcadia books. He's done Snotty Saves the Day, and he's done Report to Megalopolis, which we're going to talk about a little teeny bit tonight in the midst of talking about other visionary fiction. So welcome again. Thank you, Newport Library. Thank you, Catherine, for organizing all of this. And Laura, who should drop in on us for a few minutes, I think. I'm going to start by reading a fairy tale, an Arcadian fairy tale from the Lizard Princess, actually, because I realized it has something to do with what we're talking about tonight. And there's the illustration for it, which Mike Madrid did. Pretty good. I know. It's called Three Young Women and Death. Right? Three young women were friends. One came from Neapolis, the town they call the Prudent. One from Paloma, called the Vain. The third was from Ricken, known as Abstemious, but this is a joke, for people from Ricken are famous for their love of the good life. These three had known each other all their lives, and they loved meeting to tell stories and to laugh. What they liked most of all was to laugh. So they met one spring to tell stories and to laugh, and to look for mushrooms in a mountain meadow after the warm rains. There they met Death. This was no surprise, for Death was often found with mushrooms sprouting after the warm spring rains. Here are three caskets, Death said. And there they were, one brass, one silver, one gold, just like in all fairy tales. You may choose, and the one who chooses best may have her heart's desire. The young women knew what Death meant. The two who chose worst would leave with her that day and walk along the road of the dead. You first, Death said to the young woman from Neapolis, but she, Prudent, refused to go before her friends. You then, Death said to the young woman from Paloma. She was silent, for she had a secret wish to be more beautiful than her fellows. Her friends, knowing her thoughts, laughed. She shook her head. Then you, Death said to the life-loving young woman from Ricken, surely you will want your heart's desire. But the young woman from Ricken said, my heart's desire is to sit with my friends and hear a story that no one has ever heard before. So the three young women, knowing each other's thoughts, laughed together, for this was a wish that did not need death. And still laughing, the young women from Neapolis, Paloma, and Ricken fell onto the new meadow grass. Death couldn't help but laugh herself, so good-humored Death sat and told them a story no one had ever heard before. Then she sent them home, each with a gift, though what those gifts were, their towns keep secret to this day. The three young women lived long and happy lives, even when sorrow overtook them, as it must all that lives. And when Death returned, she came for all of them at once. And the three old women walked together on the road of the dead, telling stories and laughing, for what they liked best was to laugh. So I think what we need, given in the present emergency, which I think no one can deny, and which seems to be deepening every day, is we need a story no one's ever heard before. That was why that struck me as being something that I should read today. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time to talk about someone who did write a story that no one had ever written before and what it meant and how it reverberates down. And then I'm going to talk about some versions of visionary fiction which have been written mostly in the West, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. It's like the Pacific Northwest of America and of Canada is like a hotbed of utopian thinking. Why that might be, I am not entirely sure. I have some theories, and I have a feeling that some people here have some theories about that too, and I'd love to hear them. It's one reason why when my husband says when things get very stressful here, can't we move to Spain? And I always say, you know, I am not an expat. I was born to be a Pacific Northwest girl, and I'm going to die a Pacific Northwest girl. So, and he says, well, I love you more than Spain, so we better stay here. Also, we have a dog that would die if we put her in a jet, so we're never going to move to Spain. So where I want to start is with Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein in 1816. I don't know how much any of you know about Mary Shelley, but she is worth investigating. She was the child of William Godwin, who was a famous windbag, and you know, unfortunately, very brilliant. So that's really a shame to have a father windbag and brilliant. But she was his child and the child of Mary Wollstonecraft, who died in childbirth, who died because of the doctor who didn't wash his hands, essentially, and so she had what they called childbed fever. So Mary Shelley grew up kind of thinking she'd killed her mother. She had all sorts of conflicting feelings. Her father had strong feelings about the liberation of women, but it didn't apply to his daughter, as usual. So she ran off with Percy Bysshe Shelley when she was 16, and she was pregnant. She was pregnant 5 times in the time they were together, which I think was only like 7 or 8 years. Only one child survived. The first child, she died almost immediately after birth, probably because Percy Bysshe believed more in his ideology than he did in taking care of Mary. So he insisted that they be vegetarian in the winter in London, and there was no vegetarian food in the winter in London. It was just root vegetables. He ate potatoes and carrots, and she essentially was undernutrited when she was pregnant. So when she says, let my hideous progeny come forth, it's coming from a very emotional place when she writes Frankenstein. Her story, essentially, Frankenstein, which is a brand new thing, which had never come into literature before, is essentially about the split between why we do things and how we do things. Up till that point, science had not been a separate thing. Dr. Frankenstein is not called a scientist, let alone a mad scientist. He is called a natural philosopher. And philosophy was one of the arts. And all art was about, why are we here? Where are we going? Why are we going there? What is it best for us to do, right? She actually is writing about a man who decides to turn his back on relationship and instead wants to create a child without help of a woman. So essentially, it's about a conflict of putting belief and putting ideology ahead of relationship, right? Has anybody read a scientist named Brian Easlia? Does anybody know who I mean? I mean, Brian Griffith and I have, because I think I was throwing that book at him for a while there. You don't remember? He wrote some brilliant books. He's a scientist who I think he went to Latin America on a scientific conference. He's a physicist at the University of Sussex, I think. And when he was in South America, he suddenly realized that science had gotten away from thinking about why we are and was only thinking about how we can do things. And so he switched his discipline to scientific ethics, especially looking at nuclear war and the possibility of nuclear war and looking at the invention of the bomb and why had scientists done that when science was supposed to be about life-giving, right? So he wrote a book called Fathering the Unthinkable, Masculinity, Scientists, and the Nuclear Arms Race. And he says about Frankenstein in that book, it is the most convincing feminist analysis of masculine science that I know, which I totally agree with. And probably it's not a surprise to any of you here that all the stuff I do is feminist. Okay, we won't tell anybody that because people get hysterical when you tell them that. So he also wrote a book called Liberation and the Aims of Science, essentially saying, what are our aims here? I mean, really, we need to have aims. He was trying to put in his books, he was trying to put the how and the why back together. So when I wrote Report to Megalopolis, which, oh, wait a minute, I didn't bring it. Hang on a sec. Also designed by Mike Madrid, beautifully, and beautifully recorded by Colby Elliott. That was what I was referring to. I was referring to a scientist who doesn't understand who he is and doesn't understand why he is doing what he is doing. He is just doing it because that is what you do in Megalopolis. You try and discover as many things as you can. And also, you try to do it as only men without women. And of course, he ends up destroying everything he loves as a result of doing that. It's my version of Frankenstein, essentially. What my hero has is what Shelley points out Dr. Frankenstein had, and what I think her own husband and her own father had, which is a split between thought and feeling. They weren't together. Thought was considered much more important. Feeling was only for women. This really gets going around 1816 with the Industrial Revolution and we're still at the end of that, the technological revolution. So we're seeing the end of that kind of belief when science split off from art somewhere. I know the first usage of the word scientist, I think, is like 1830. It's not very far after she's written that. Oh, 18 what? 1804? Really? That early? Hey, unmute.
Wait, no, I was slow on the unmute. 1834.
Oh, 1834. Thank you.
I know that because it's in my research, so sorry.
Girl. So yeah. So, I mean, we see that. And we tend to think now, oh, science, it's always been this way. But no, it has not always been this way. So experience tells us what works, right? Science focuses on what works. But imagination affirms that what worked yesterday may not be working today and won't work tomorrow. And I think we are definitely in that situation now, that what had worked before is not working now. I think pretty much everyone agrees about that. I saw in The Guardian yesterday, 3/4 of people in the world's wealthiest nations believe humanity is pushing the planet toward a dangerous tipping point and support a shift of priorities away from economic profit, according to a global survey. So really pretty much anyone who doesn't have huge things, or who isn't insane, like Jeff Bezos, for example, everybody realizes that we are doing that we have got to knit things back together. We've got to knit back together. Why are we doing all of this? What is the point of it? And I actually want to tell a sort of funny anecdote. My husband in this small town that we're at the beach is part of the roads committee. And he is in charge of dealing with the highway people and the roads people in this little town, trying to convince them that we need to put a concrete barrier up on a very dangerous curve on Highway 101 where cars speed up, but the entire town and all the tourists use to go around and cross the bridge to go from the north part of the town to the south part of the town. It's very dangerous. If you're walking a dog or you have a small child, it's really scary. So he suggested the concrete barrier, and somebody from the roads committee said, no, we can't do that. And he said, why? And he said, because it might scratch the cars. Is that making you guys laugh? I mean, I woke up the next morning laughing. I was like, well, that's true. Soft tissue is much, much easier on cars than concrete. Why would anyone say a thing like that? But that's kind of where we got. We've gotten compartmentalized. So imagination is trying to provide the what to the how. The what has to come from the why we do things. And imagination is trying to say, here's what we could do and here's what we should do. And some of the most, the best books, I think, about those are, for example, Ursula K. LeGuin, who I know I go on and on about her, but there's a reason. She wrote a fabulous book, which maybe a lot of you have read, called The Dispossessed, which is about a colony on the moon that split off from Earth and has everything in common. And it's like, kind of like a kibbutz on the moon. But one of their laws is you're not allowed to communicate with people on Earth because they're worried that they're going to be overrun by the ideology of the Earth. And the hero is a scientist, and he can't be constrained like this. He has to communicate with other scientists, and so he does. He's absolutely vilified in his own home, and he travels down to Earth. And the one thing that really struck me is he goes and he talks to large groups of very well-dressed, well-spoken, well-educated people on Earth, and he explains why the way that they live on the moon has many benefits for a larger group of people. And he says in the book, and they make me hate them because they're listening to me and going, oh, how brilliant. You're so right. And then they completely forget what I said the minute they leave. Does this sound familiar? Anybody? Anyway, she also wrote a wonderful book, which I'm going to quote in a minute, called The Word for the World is Forest, which is set on another planet where the word for the world is forest. And I really recommend that one. There's The Lathe of Heaven. You know, she's written so many books about what the world could be like. Another Pacific Northwest writer, Ernest Callenbach, wrote Ecotopia in 1975, and it's kind of, David Horowitz is nodding, so he loves that book. I love that book. I don't have it here, I have it in the Colstein. But it probably inspired many green movements. It's a novel. It's the first modern description of an ecological utopia, essentially. But the thing that struck me, because I remember I started to read it and I thought, well, how is the Pacific Northwest and California have skived off from the rest of the United States in disgust, and they have become an ecotopia, and that's what they call themselves. And I thought, how is he working it that the ecotopians are not being overrun by the military forces on the other side? And the way he does it is he has nuclear weapons planted by ecotopians in various places in the United States, including Washington, D.C., with the threat that if there is any invasion, they will set them off. And you never know if those devices ever exist or not, but he uses that as the way to keep them away from him. So I just thought to myself, you know, I wish there was a better way to deal with it. But hey, it was an ingenious way. Another author who is a Brian Griffith favorite, and I think it was Brian Griffith who turned me on to her, is Starhawk, The Fifth Sacred Thing. She wrote that in 1993. She, like Octavia Butler, who I've talked about a lot in these things, is her book is very, it is not all sun and puppies, you know. Essentially what the people who want to start a new way of life have to do is, I think what the phrase is they have to say to people who are trying to kill them, please come and eat at my table. And they have to do that over and over again and not fight. Because if you do fight, you've just gotten yourself involved in exactly the same problem. So that's a fascinating book. I highly recommend that one. Then, of course, there is Walida Emerisha and Adrienne Marie Brown's collection, Octavia's Brood, which is a bunch of short. Walida Emerisha, I think, is the originator of the phrase visionary fiction, which she defined as any kind of story of any genre that arcs toward social justice, which I thought was just brilliant.
What was that title again?
Octavia's Brood.
Okay.
Yeah, and it is, and meaning the brood of Octavia Butler, the science fiction writer who lived in Seattle. I think it was Seattle, wasn't it? I mean, who wrote some really intense, and actually, Brian, you should look at Octavia Butler's work too. You should look at Kindred, I think, especially for what you're working on right now. Brian's starting work on a book on the history of forgiveness, which I personally think is a fabulous idea. I may come back for that one. So Octavia's Brood is a collection of short stories from various writers in the Pacific Northwest, all arcing towards social justice. I think, I can't remember, but I think Walita's story in there is about a world where there are no prisons, for example. That's one of the ideas. And then my own History of Arcadia books, that was why I started writing them, essentially, was to try and figure out for myself, was there a way? Was there a way for a society more based on mutual aid and joy, rather than as, what did Mary, at one point, Mary Shelley says in her last book, The Last Man, she says, oh, by the way, the last man is the last man. The entire world's been destroyed in Mary Shelley's last book before she died. But she says, what is there in our nature that is forever urging us on to pain and misery? Which is a really good question, because it isn't just, I mean, I have a problem with my left, forgive me if there's anyone here who's like that, with some of my leftist friends who insist that it's the ruling class. Whereas if you look at history, the ruling class changes over and over again, and they always behave the same way. Now, why is that? That means that if you and I were part of the ruling class, we would behave the same way. What's interesting is, why do we behave that way? What does it mean about our lack of consciousness? What would happen if we became more conscious? And perhaps we will. I mean, obviously we are in little pockets, that there are certain individuals who are becoming more conscious. It just doesn't, how does it catch? How does it catch fire into the general population is I think, one of the reasons why a lot of us are writers and also publishers. Christina Ward and Steve Scholl being publishers, and I think both having been motivated by exactly that. So what Ursula Le Guin says in The Word for the World is Forest is, he had feared he was cut off from his roots, that he'd gone too far into the dead land of action, ever to find his way back to the springs of reality. Now, though the water was very bitter, he drank again. So how do we go back to the springs of reality? I'm going to also quote from Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. And I have a funny story about this quote. I once put this quote on the blackboard. Boy, that was a long time ago that we had blackboards, when I was teaching English at UCLA. And I had my students read it. And the quote is, they who know of no purer sources of truth, who have traced up its stream no higher, stand, and wisely stand, by the Bible and the Constitution, and drink at it there with reverence and humility. But they who behold where it comes trickling into this lake or that pool, gird up their loins once more and continue their pilgrimage toward its fountainhead. I had a hard time getting my students to understand that quote. They could not get past the Bible and the Constitution. They just could not believe there was anything beyond the Bible and the Constitution. Isn't that interesting? It was like a kind of blindness. I said, you know, you have it in you where the Bible and the Constitution came from. Every one of you has that. Every human being has that, because it came from inside of us. It came from an unconscious that we all share. I think I finally got them to sort of see it, but that was interesting for me. So I thought now we could move on to girding up our loins and talking about what a better world would look like and what would truly satisfy our human needs, what those needs are, how art can help by going to the fountainhead and bringing back new truths, and how these can be expressed in all forms of art and in all forms of media. So with that, I am going to reintroduce Marissa Bell Toffoli, our poetry editor, and ask her her opinion about what poetry does. I mean, I have noticed, Marissa, and you and I have talked about this, that the present emergency has almost like smoking a beehive has made poets go crazy. We are getting inundated with poetry about these kind of themes where we weren't before.
This is
Marissa.
not a complaint to say that. I mean, it's wonderful, but it was really interesting watching that unfold over the past year. Thanks, Todd. It's true. We really, I don't know, we've had a good community for poets, but it has been just every time things are coming in early and all the time. And it's wonderful. I love getting to read through everything. I will try to be as articulate as possible. My headphones aren't working, so I apologize if some background noise comes through for you guys. There's a cat meowing and some children getting ready for bed. So anyhow, hopefully you can't hear it. I think that, all forms of writing, but poetry in particular is an opportunity to really push language to describe things that we're thinking about, a way that people are reckoning with, their ideas, their feelings, their experiences. And if you're writing something down, personally, I feel that, there are things we write down for ourselves, but a lot of times if you're writing something down, there's a desire to communicate, to in some way share those thoughts with someone else, to work through that as a community, not necessarily in isolation. So that's maybe the shortest way that I can say, I believe there's an opportunity with language in particular and poetry and what it does in asking people to put some constraints or think about different ways to explore what they're trying to say, so that they don't just take maybe the first thing that they thought of, but they say, okay, is that really, really exactly what I meant? Is that, the right word for this instance? Is there a better word? It really, I think, pushes for specificity and a deeper understanding of something. And there's huge opportunity there for us to say, okay, what if, what if I have this poem about the day at the beach, but what if I look at it from this angle instead? What if, you can turn it on its head and say, this is the thing I was feeling in that moment, but what if I look from outside myself? What's this other character or person thinking? And then what if, this is maybe the experience of what happened, but what if the world were different and the setting changes? And you can sort of layer in these things. And of course, stories do that as well. But I find that poetry, for me anyway, just pushes me to really condense that and refine the different ideas. And I love that. Like, the thing that I sit down to start writing is always different by the time I get to the end. There's always some surprise. And I think that's one of the great joys and one of the ways that can help us to both expand our thinking and bring new ways of being and, new ideas for the change that, Todd's talking about that we want to see, but also to bring truth back, that there's real personal experience, at the core of these things, and people reaching out to communicate and work on things together, and an opportunity for sharing thoughts and discussing it. So that's what I've been thinking about as we were looking at this topic and thinking about what Todd's been sharing all summer, and I just keep coming back to that. But I would love to hear more about what the rest of you think. There are a lot of poets on the call, so tell me about what it means for you when you start writing that.
I'm gonna interrupt just 1 minute, and then I'm gonna turn it over to, we've definitely got 3 poets here, at the very least. But I just also want to say that one of the things about poetry is that, ironically, or I don't know if ironically is the right word, but things that are universal only come out of things that are individual. So it only comes out of individual human experience. It isn't like you can think in a grand way about a universal concept. It has to come out of individual feeling. So we've got David Horowitz, who is a poet and has his own poetry press, Rose Alley Press, but he publishes with us little essays, which are really great. Every single issue is another essay. And we've got David Bolton, who is a new poet to EAP, who Marissa and I are fond of his work, and Barry Vitkoff, who I'm also fond of his work. So now I will turn it over to the other poets. Who wants to talk first?
Thanks, Tom.
Well, I guess I could start from greetings from the East Coast. I wouldn't call Baltimore the most bucolic place in the world, but it is a city of writers. The pandemic for me has actually been an opportunity where, because of the isolation and the separation and everything, that I had, I guess you could call it an explosion of creativity, because I wrote I wrote in a year's time. I wrote a novel, and Love Is Where You Find It. And I also wrote a book of poetry called um, a mind full of nothing. And I had 5 sections in this this book of poetry. I start with Songs of Darkness, because that's the most poignant one that it's on people's minds. And I have various poems that describe different aspects of the darkness, and some of it has to do with who's in power and that sort of thing. And then I have Songs of the Earth, which is more of a nurturing aspect, and the experiences I've had, mystical experiences I've had in nature, what for me has been the most healing experiences I've had. And then Songs of Love, the love that because I'm an old man, I'm 73 years old, and I've experienced love in many different forms. I've been married 3 times. I've lost a wife to cancer, and one was divorced, and now I have another woman that's just been wonderful. I feel fortunate because I've experienced love in so many manifestations, and I write about love. And then I wrote about songs in passing, because now I'm at the time in my life where I'm experiencing death, my friends and family and so forth. And I end up being called upon to write these poems for funerals, and I celebrate the person's life. And then the last part is Songs of Spirit, and that's the final message, where, because the fountain that I have drawn upon within myself to create these poems is something we all share: the same spirit, the same dignity, the same sense of, like, what the ancient Greeks talked about, the ethos and the pathos and the logos. And we have this sharing of humanity. And the Songs of the Spirit are all about discovering the soul, so to speak, and joining in the soul's journey. I hope that makes some sense to people.
No, that totally does. That totally does. And to break up the Davids, Barry, what's your feeling about this?
Barry's in the middle of the D's, huh?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this. It's the first time I've had the opportunity to tune in, and I'm finding it really fascinating because I've never been much of a science fiction aficionado. Only recently have I even read some science fiction stories, and I just finished reading Clara and the Sun today, Ishiguro's latest novel, which has gotten mixed reviews. I found it utterly fascinating and more informative about the world to be, the world that may be, and what could be with artificial intelligence and the consequences of that. First of all, I have to say this: as a poet, I hardly ever understand somebody else's poetry. I think poetry is such an intimate affair that only the poet really understands what they're trying to do, and then they cast it out there and try to, and maybe somebody else gets some meaning out of it, but never the same meaning that may have been intended. I find poetry to be the most difficult stuff I can read, and the most difficult stuff I can write. As Marissa was saying, I'll sit down to write a poem, and I might write. Typically, it happens just before I go to bed, and something occurs to me, and I write down a couple of lines on my notepad, and I'll wake up several times in the evening, and then I'll kind of struggle with things for 3 or 4 or 5 days, and it never ends the way I thought it was going to end. In fact, most of the time, I don't know where I'm going when I start, and then it sort of develops, and then I have a poem that I get some meaning out of, and maybe somebody else will enjoy. Lately, I have been consumed. Well, I was consumed a lot by the pandemic, and I was getting terribly moody and down in the dumps. And then, fortunately, we had all this smoke pour into our valley, and it created an even gloomier sense for me. And then we were hit by the United Nations report that came out on climate change, and it just bowled me over. And it's been a source of inspiration. I've been writing a lot lately about stuff I see in the news. I just finished a poem the other day. It's a horrible poem. I'm still working on it. But I read about shellfish being cooked on the seashore because of climate change. And I'm thinking, there's a poem in there somewhere. I have to deal with it. I have to find some way to cope with that. I wrote a poem called An Abbreviated Frogmore Stew about shellfish being cooked on the shoreline. So I think when we talk about visionary fiction or visionary writing, I'm thinking that poets have an opportunity to create a sort of intimate experience that may help others to cope, or others to explore their own feelings and their own paths. And you know, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
That's a very poetic way to put it, dude.
I love that. That's,
David Horowitz.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I've got some remarks and observations to offer, somewhat different than what we've been hearing, but I've really appreciated the level of insight and innovativeness of the comments thus far. So this is a complimentary rather than a conflictual. Well, I'm a formal poet and I write in rhyme and meter, so my understanding of poetry might be a little different. First of all, I haven't heard the word music. For me, poetry is the intersection of language and music. And the word resonance, it lives with you, it sticks with you. The rhythms and the music of the language. Yes, the physical imagery is important and the diction is important and the connotations and denotations are important, but the sound of it, the rhythm of it as your blood and veins take it in are critical. And with that in mind, for me, a poem is a community of words. And when you see it that way, you understand the power of poetry towards connectivity, metaphor and simile, rhyme and meter, drawing attention to the relationships between words rather than emphasizing that they're separate. So there's an implicit communitarianism about a poem. And other people, I hear where Barry's coming from. Believe me, I do understand the difficulty of communicating, but I'm a little more of an optimist about the ability to get that to be understood. I don't think it's always obscure for people, and that's a beautiful thing. You can connect people through that poem. So, for me, song, pattern, rhythm, and resonance are critical. Pattern, how in a pattern, every element is distinct, yet everything is connected and belongs to the whole. So for me, as a formal poet, rhyme and meter are a way of communicating connectivity and creating connectivity. Now, there's other elements here that are critically important. And one thing I've been really thinking about, we're talking about create a new world and innovating and reimagining. For me, I'm 65, the 20th century had all kinds of visionaries. Let's just get rid of the Jews and everything would be great. Let's just get rid of these rich people and massacre them and then everything will be great. Let's get rid of these peasants who aren't behaving with our collective program and then everything will be great. Let's get rid of all these people from the old China who like Western things and Western music and kill them off. Then it'll be a new humanity. I'm a little wary of all this. I'm a little wary. There's been all kinds of utopian murderers. And there have been all kinds of utopian humanitarians who've done, it's a mixed bag. And one way we avoid the danger, and this relates to poetry, for me, one thing we need to get past, stereotyping. That is an ist. That person over there is one of the evil ists. If we just get rid of those kinds of ists, everything will be fine. Our ism is going to work perfectly if we just get rid of our enemies. So for me, poetry, what Marissa was saying about the complexity, the discovering the layers of complexity, is a metaphor for discovering the layers of complexity in humanity, our own contradictions, our own complexity, our own mistakes, our own fallibility. And when you write a poem, you're revising and you're discovering, I didn't think that phrase would work, but now it does. But now these other phrases don't quite work. And after you bump up against one of the most important things you can ever bump up against that's good for you. Life is complex. People are complex. That's okay. And where we avoid the mistakes is, and this is in praise of older people, patience. The patience to let all the stuff surface, the patience to listen, the patience to understand, the patience to explore, the patience to doubt, the patience to redo something. Even though you're frustrated and having to do that, your literary conscience tells you it's not quite right yet and you're gonna have to redo it to get there. And that's something that comes with experience. It's something that comes with age. So avoid stereotyping by understanding, cultivating complexity, cultivating your conscience, and not fearing complexity. Last point, one of the ways that tyrants work successfully is intimidation, harassment, threats, creating a social structure where people are hounded and pestered and threatened if they speak up. Look at what's happening in Afghanistan. Imagine being a woman now speaking up. That ongoing respect for the need to explore complexity rather than settle for dogma. And there's a lot of reward in settling for dogma. If you tell Donald Trump he's the greatest thing that ever walked and everything he does is fine, and you stick to that line, you'll be rewarded by his network. And the same, there's plenty of people on the left like this too. You shut up about this and shut up about that. No, philosophy pushes us towards truth. Dogma pushes us towards hating. And it's that I fear in a theocracy. Anything that's viewed with these traditional religious enthusiasms invariably wind up filled with hatred. So poetry brings us back to the complexity of the individual voice. It doesn't have to be your own. You can write a poem in somebody else's voice. It brings us back to the difficulty of finding the right words. It brings us back to the physical details. It brings us back to the music that gives us some togetherness. So those are my thoughts. I hope that's of some value.
And it's a great segue to talking to Colby about what we're going to talk with Colby about. But I want to make two comments. One, when you talk about poetry being related to music, music, of course, is a way of expressing things that cannot be expressed in words, but that everyone can get.
Right.
When you talk about words connecting, that's the media being the message. So I want to turn it over to Colby Elliott to talk about what his experiences are with audiobooks. And do you have experiences with games too, Colby?
Absolutely, yeah. As a matter of fact, that was something I was going to mention. But first of all, it's like, oh, I have to go on after three poets. Come on, man! Like they're profound and saying all these cool things, and it's like, great. Okay, let's talk about audiobooks.
Yeah, but you're an actor, Colby, so we're just going to be amazed that you can say anything at all, as a producer.
You're going to make it sound really good.
Excellent.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and let me just first start by saying that, like the stuff that I've done for Exterminating Angel, it's kind of like I feel like a singer who has the best composers that I get to work for. I love Todd. I love your words, Mike. Oh man, the way you write your words, I love it, man. I so do. It's just a pleasure to do them. It really is. And we start with audiobooks, and that's like you go so far back. You go back to the oral tradition, and you got the cavemen who are pointing up to the buffalo on the wall, but audiobooks now brings that up to the cinematic perfection, because I get this chance in the studio to do as many takes as I want to get it exactly perfect. And so I can do that bardic mission, that traveling minstrel, and get it absolutely perfect at one time. And then I find that to be really great. And then there's also, I have that level of intimacy because I'm right in your ear and I'm telling those stories. So I have that moment where I can be there, just the two of us sharing this moment. And I think that intimacy is super, super important. And it's intimacy for me as the narrator too, because I feel like I get to know these artists and the authors in such a way that, and I know it doesn't work both ways. It's a one-way thing. They're giving me all of their wonderful thoughts, their innermost thoughts, and I'm projecting them out there as their voice. And I feel as if I have a oneness with them, which is just, really amazing. So I guess I'm talking about the delivery method here too. So if I think of this like audiobooks, and you were mentioning gaming, I want to look at it for a minute like an educator. So when I was a theater teacher for 12 years, and you probably could never tell that. I love teaching. And so you have three different types of learners in your classroom. You have the visual learners, you have the audio learners, and then you have the kinesthetic learners. And for the visual learners, in terms of literature, there is that physical book or that digital book that you put in front of them. And then for the audio learners, there is the audiobook, that thing that I'm talking about doing right now. But then we also have to keep in mind that there is something for the kinesthetic learner, and that's the gaming aspect that Todd was talking about. And that is tabletop role-playing games. You look at like Dungeons and Dragons, and what that is collaborative storytelling around a dining room table with dice being used as the element of chance in the universe, and each moment being crafted by one of the artists at the table as the whole piece that you're doing together. And then they're working out the story as they're telling it. And that's that kinesthetic aspect to it. One of the things that I said, I had the honor of actually winning the Best Digital Book for the Emmy Awards in 2019. And in my acceptance speech, one of the things that I said was that role-playing games are how we change the world, because every time you have someone who's a dungeon master or a game master, they're drawing together 4 or 5 friends for the common purpose of creating a communal story together. And so every person who's a dungeon master is bringing those people together and telling a communal story. And that is, I think, you can't get much more visionary than that. It's like, together, this is what we think this can be. And it can be a heroic trope. It can be a romantic trope. It can be a tale of loss. It can be a tale of redemption. It's kind of amazing, and you get a chance to identify with each one of those. And sometimes you have to identify with someone who is profoundly unpleasant. Aspern Grayling. Boy, he's the protagonist of Report to Megalopolis. And I can tell you that and I hate him, and I absolutely love him. And I see everything that through his eyes, and I go, you are forever trying to earn the love of the women in your life. And you always will be trying to do that and you're going about it the wrong way. But you do deserve it. You do deserve, as anyone, deserves love, but he keeps going about it the wrong way and trying to prove it the wrong way and destroying things because his methodology is so wrong. But what he wants and what he desires and what he craves is so very human. And I love him for that. At the same time, I think, what a douche. And okay, and then now let's go back a few books, and we look at Snotty in Snotty Saves the Day. Well, that's someone who hasn't gotten to where they are yet. They're still going through their chrysalis, their arc of transformation. And you have to be there and know that during those points in the arc of your transformation, you probably weren't perfect. I know I wasn't. I go back and I would say to myself, gosh, if I could go back to the students that I had my first year of teaching, what would I say to them now? I would go, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was not nearly as good as I was as I was at the end. And I think, you see Snotty begin that arc, that transformation, until she becomes this person that she was always meant to be. And there's that beautiful arc there, but you have to identify all the ways along the way and accept those warts too. And identifying with that other and that thing that isn't pleasant immediately. And like David, like you're saying, you can't just kill them off. And I think there was a Mad magazine one time that I saw one time called The Super Patriot. And it talked about how he wanted to eliminate everyone in there who he didn't feel like was exactly the right form of patriot. And basically he got rid of everyone in the United States. And I see what you're saying there. But there's also something about, that path of visionary fiction allows you to look at those very imperfect individuals along their arc of development in their moments of imperfection. And you as an audience member, or at least me as the narrator who's trying to portray them, must love them in their moment of frailty, in their moment where they are doing something that will be regrettable, that they will need to be redeemed for. But that's an element I think that is visionary. That's the visionary part of it, is that putting that empathy there.
Well said. That leads me to want to bring Christina Ward and Steve Scholl into the conversation to talk about why they got into independent publishing, which, as we know, most people do it to make tons of money and become famous and hang out with celebrities. Haha. So, Christina.
Well, I unmuted. We're here to make people thousandaires. So, but I felt listening to everybody. So we publish nonfiction, stridently nonfiction, and a lot of my own work and research work is on I realize is the nonfiction aspect of what you're talking about visionary stuff. I'm working right. I'm up north at our cabin. 60s communes.
Oh yeah.
Heartland utopias. And something that resonates, I think, and hasn't really been talked about are the people who've taken these visionary outlines for a society and have actually then worked to manifest them, to create them in reality. And I think it's an interesting process that people, and the major thing, and I also pulled up a quote, one of my favorites, Violet Tranchant, who better known by her pen name Octavia Butler, who was part of the Paris Commune in 1871 and wrote critically about it. And her fantastic quote about it is, "Every society invents the failed utopia it deserves." And so my point being is, if we look at people like Nation of Islam is a great example. Many white people aren't familiar at all with the Nation of Islam, except for their external kind of presentation, not familiar with their cosmology or their religious beliefs, which are based on essentially a visionary narrative, a retelling of human history to allow for Black people to not be oppressed, to recast their own oppression in a way that allows them to live in a white dominant society, as well as then vision and work towards a way where they would not be oppressed by that white society. That's just one example of many groups, especially ones that take their visionary ideas and narratives and then create a religion around it. It seems to be the way, especially in the United States, because of the Bible and the Constitution. United States is really one of the only places that one can do that, to essentially invent God. And it's something that since the even prior to the founding of America, we've done that as a people. We essentially reject your reality and substitute our own. And that to me is very interesting, and I find correlating to what you're talking about, that there's that small chasm, I think, that people can leap across of visionary fiction as a way to work through some of those ideas, and visionary poetry to somehow imbue those ideas with an emotion, to then the visionary reality of people who essentially invent it and then manifest it and then make it real. And as a publisher, I'm always very interested in stories, those nonfiction stories of people who do that, or people who have those kinds of ideas.
And that's Brian Griffith, as far as I'm concerned, writes visionary history. I mean, he's writing history that comes from a position of wanting social justice and wanting to know how has social justice been dealt with in previous generations. The books he wrote for me and the books he's writing for other people. His most recent book is actually about social justice for animals, essentially. Brian, what did they end up calling it? It was called Our War with the Animals, but it's called something different now. Oh, you're mute. You're mute. Unmute. No, you're still mute. Nope. He's mute. We can't hear you.
There we go. Hello?
Yep.
Does it work? Oh, sorry, wrong click. Yeah, that's called War and Peace with the Beasts.
Right.
And about how we've, divided the world into the wanted and unwanted parts. And our progress has been to eliminate the unwanted parts, all the unwanted creatures, and what that has done. And there's a lot of peacemaking stories as well, of building, constructive and creative relations with animals. So I don't know. There's a lot of stories I'd like to see people explore about relation building and where it leads, and concerning the theme that Christina mentioned about how people have done these things in history. I've really enjoyed putting together the stories of Persian women through the centuries, and their visions and their struggles, and some of the most heroic people I've ever learned about. And I think a lot of them are at least as powerful as Martin Luther King. And
It's a tremendous book, and I really should publish it. And I was trying to get Steve Scholl to publish it, but he got out of publishing right when I was trying to do that. Catherine, can we have a few more minutes? Because I just want Steve to contribute a little bit.
Sure, just a few I think would be fine. Yeah, that sounds good.
Steve?
Well, I'd like to, am I coming through?
You are.
Okay. I'd like to talk for maybe 45 minutes if I could. So anyway, I've talked to Todd a little bit about this, and we've bounced a few things back. This is, as she has noted from the get-go, we are in an emergency situation. We are in desperate times. I don't think I've ever felt as depressed in my life as I have felt over the last month, and especially the last 2 weeks, whether it's fires in Siberia, Greece, Turkey, the West Coast, flooding and earthquakes in Haiti, and of course, what's happening in Afghanistan.
Don't forget that pandemic.
Oh yeah, and that pandemic thing.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's just been really hard for everybody in the world, and we have it easier than almost everybody else. And so what I have found in my publishing life is that publishing has always been a place where things can happen to create a better future, a better today. And so just one aspect of why I love publishing, even though I'm getting out of it. When I first started White Cloud Press in 1993, doing books on world religion, spirituality, and some more cultural and social issues, I assumed that publishers who were doing the same kinds of books were my competitors. And what I had found over the years is that they were my best friends, my best champions, my best support group. Todd is one of them, she is the queen of all networking in the world, I believe. And she, she just wants to help people connect who can help each other. And it just, and that is kind of what the publishing world is like. And it is a model for making things better in the world. And it gives me hope, and it gives me, in these dark times,
Well, that is the perfect grace note to end on, I think, Steve. I was thinking I was going to have to get in there when you were talking about all the other stuff and just mention that this has been delightful. It's been wonderful to be able to gather everybody together, and especially since we're all in different places, and we couldn't actually easily gather together in a room and have a glass of wine or a beer together. Which I greatly regret, especially the wine part. So thank you so much, Catherine and Newport Public Library, for facilitating this. And I think a record of this will be available in a couple of days. And this one, I think, was the best one of the three that we've done. So thank you very much for everyone who participated. Love you all.